Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Colombian Influence. This is a podcast where we talk about adoption using our own experiences as adoptees as well as others in the community. I guess if you're new here, welcome. I am Erica. I don't think we've really ever introduced ourselves.
In a while. No.
And so if you're new, I'm Erica.
I'm Risa.
Risa.
Yes.
My co-host.
Yeah.
We're both adopted from Bogota, Colombia. And we are doing a book club series. So we are on the second part of the Primal Wound, and we are going to start with chapter 5.
I'm ready for part 2. I feel like actually when we started part 2, it was, as far as subject matter, it is very because it's kind of talking more about, I don't know, I think we got more vibes as far as other parts of the triad versus just the adoptees. So I'm excited to kind of talk about this and see what comes of the conversation. So Let's dive into part 2, which is titled The Manifestations. And chapter 5 that we're starting with is Love, Trust, and the Adoptive Mother. So, seatbelt, everyone.
And I noticed these 2 chapters are a little bit longer than the other ones.
Yeah.
And I don't know why that is, if that's going to be how it is for the rest of the book, but I did notice that. So bear with us if it goes a little bit longer than our normal half an hour session, but we are excited. I guess to start off, part 2 in the book, before we even jump into chapter 5, I saw 2 quotes that I really thought were good. The first one was, "I am adopted. You wouldn't know it to meet me," which is very interesting. Like, when I look at you, I don't know you're adopted. And we have noticed that with the community, too. Like, we have got in contact with so many people who are adopted who we had no idea. Even when we used to work together, we had 5 people in our own family.
I remember our department actually finally was not a minority as far as, or adoptees weren't the minority. I remember telling my uncle that once at Thanksgiving. He was like, "What? Wow, that's amazing."
Yeah.
I'm like, it kind of is, I'll take that. That's a really cool element of, our last workplace where we met, was just our department was being overrun by adoptees, which was a really big surprise.
I thought that was really cool.
Yeah.
And then another one there, it's a longer little introduction to the next section, but then it also stated, "The adopted child will never, or can never grow up. Who has ever heard of an adult adoptee?"
I remember reading that also and just being like, well, here we are. That is what we will do with this.
So you hear about us now.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess we'll just jump into chapter 5 then.
Yes. At the bottom, "Who has heard of us?"
Yeah.
is what I wrote here. I was like, what is happening here? So
very interesting.
And I guess it kind of goes back to what you said about it being a longer, or the chapters being longer, because the intro is pretty lengthy as well.
Yeah, I thought I was reading the chapter and I'm like,
so did I.
Wait,
I was
this
like,
is not it.
There's more. Okay, well, let's dive into chapter 5. We had a lot of things, and typically how we're kind of going through it is just talking about what sticks out to us. And I think this first chapter we had some similar, actually both of these, there are a lot that some stuck out that were the same, some that were really different, but should we start at the first section, the limitations of the adoptive mother?
Yeah, we both had things on this section.
And
I think this is also going to be it's going to start off right away with one of the questions that I had.
Yeah, let's dive into that.
So it talks about the adoptive parents, mostly kind of in this chapter, and how they've been waiting for a baby, but at a point in time, they're at a disadvantage because of these 4 areas of concern. And pretty much they go through the areas. The mother has not had the benefit of the 40 weeks. Neither parent has been alerted to the fact that the baby has suffered trauma upon having been separated from their biological mother. Most adoptive parents have not dealt with their feelings or own losses, including the loss of fertility, which is a very interesting factor.
Big one too.
And that is a huge one. And then those who have already had biological children may not have adequately explored their reasons for wanting to adopt. So I guess the main question, and we'll definitely have this in our question points throughout a next post on Facebook and Instagram for you guys to discuss with us, but do adoptive parents agree with the 4 areas of concern, not being aware of those different areas of either your own loss, the trauma behind a baby and being separated from her her. My God.
His or her.
Yeah, being separated from his or her birth mother. Just kind of what are your thoughts on that? Because, of course, we're not adoptive parents. We don't know that portion of adoption. And so that would be a very interesting question. So we'd love to hear from you and hear your perspective on that.
Absolutely.
And that was page 1.
Yeah, page 1. Gosh, I love when these chapters are just like right off the bat, like, hey, here's a great nugget of knowledge. So I thought that was really interesting, just the way that it can, I don't know, that it was so blatant, like, hi, here are the 4 things. And, it makes it, I think, really, a good way to separate it and talk about it. So I like the way that this book is able to do that. And I guess just kind of with that first section, it's kind of talking about, or leading you into the rest of the chapter, saying, with things relating to your biological parents, or especially the biological, or the adoptive parents, I'm sorry, I misspoke. Going into that, I underlined at the bottom of page 54, just kind of talking about how, like, a mother can't be trusted because she may be an abandoner.
Yes, I have that part too.
Yeah, and I think it's, like, this whole chapter was just really interesting with the way that it separated those two in a way that I didn't really realize was different, but it is. So that's kind of one element of, the end of that first section, which I know...
We jumped in right to the next section.
We both felt like that one was big. Who is the abandoner is the next portion.
And I think that goes into what we've spoken on before, is love equals abandonment.
Exactly.
Because it says the child confuses the adopting mother with the abandoned mother and mistakes the term adoption for abandonment. That's very interesting to me.
Which the next sentence, because I had a bunch of notes, bunch of arrows pointing to this. Here again, the problem is seen as an intellectual dilemma rather than as inner confusion. And I wrote at the top, learned experiences become actual reaction. Because that's kind of how it turns out to be. There's just like a lot of stuff discussed in here with that. And also just discussing the confusion between the two. One paragraph that I just kind of marked completely was stating that this confusion is further noticed as adoptees alternately refer to their biological mothers and their adoptive mothers as the real mother. My observation has been that the term real is consciously for the adoptive mother. My real parents are the parents who raised me. What? Yet as adoptees become more relaxed when they say real mother, they mean the biological mother. I love my adoptive parents, but I need to find my real mother.
I have never used the term real. Real parent, real mother, real...
I think I learned somewhere early on that was, like, not right or whatever, where I was just like, this, I don't like that. And that's what I started, that was probably the first thing that I would correct people by when they would find out I was adopted.
Absolutely, because they'd always ask, so who's your real parents?
It's like...
well, let me break it
down. We can unpack that all day.
Yeah.
The feelings behind that.
Yeah.
It's just not,
Yeah, I hate
accurate.
when people say that.
Yeah, I thought that paragraph was just really interesting, though, just the way that
it goes both ways.
It does, and it's such a weird, specific thing that nobody besides adoptees get, because we all get that question.
Oh, for sure.
I don't think I've ever met an adoptee where they've said, oh, I've never heard somebody say that. Like, that's never happened, ever. Let's see. So then, moving on into the rest of it, the next chunk for me that really stuck out was on being special. And just feeling like the need to be perfect, and talking about when people say, like, well, doesn't adoption make you feel so special and great because you were chosen?
That's literally what it says.
Exactly.
Someone says being chosen means being special. And what does special mean? Like,
and I think that is a potentially really toxic conversation, or something to be said when people don't understand adoption, because it adds pressure, I think, and also it almost is kind of like, okay, yeah, all right, we can pretend I was specifically chosen by this family or God or whatever you want to call it, like whatever you want to say is chosen, but you were also chosen to be abandoned by your birth mother. Like, sorry to add it in that heavy way, but it's very true. And that actually says this need to be special can put a great deal of pressure on the child to live up basically to those expectations, which are often unattainable. The next the next section of the chapter talking about that is, let's see, what did I note here? What's so complicated is feeling chosen with just infant traits. What if I grow into a person you're ashamed of, or I don't fit into your mold?
I talked about that, I think, later in the chapter. Yeah, on page 65, it kind of talks about, it kind of, this whole chapter obviously is kind of the whole situation of this and feeling perfect and feel like you fit in with your family or adoptive family. And it's just...
Yeah. I actually just found
so hard to know.
That almost exact quote. Being chosen by your adoptive parents doesn't mean anything compared to being unchosen by your birth mother.
Yes.
And for me, this section was the biggest one in this whole chapter, was everything is underlined. I wrote SOS. Just my existence, noted over here. So that, for me, really stuck out. I don't know if that's something that you connect with as much or that you think about on a daily basis.
And this one, I definitely underlined, and I think being chosen and being talked about as being special, I've definitely had that come into play. Mm-hmm. And at times I do feel special. And I don't know if that's just because, I'm very lovable and easy to get along with.
Yeah, you are, girl.
But, with family, it's hard to know, is it because they genuinely like me, or is it because I'm adopted and they're trying to make me feel...
Overcompensating kind of thing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, you'll never know, but,
when it comes down to, actually answering that question, obviously, your family members, whether it's immediate or extended, are not being like, oh, Erica's adopted, we got to make sure she feels good about it. You know what I mean? That obviously is not something that they're even probably subconsciously thinking at all. Because, you're in your 20s now. You've been in the family for so long.
Exactly.
That would not be a question. It would be very different if that were the case. Yeah. So, obviously, when you're thinking about it that way, we can answer that question. But it's still...
I've never thought about being unchosen by my birth mom.
I don't know that I had thought about it before this. I kind of just more so put it into words.
Yeah.
Because I always felt, before reading this book and before you and I started this podcast and talking about this all the time, I always felt a little weird and didn't quite know how to be to answer when people would say well, isn't it cool that you're chosen? I'm like, you're walking on thin ice a little bit.
Yeah.
It doesn't
It's
really
just not
feel
the right words.
No,
yeah.
And it just makes you feel a little well... Are you really? Really? I don't know about that.
And it's interesting because you're from what we found from that and what we found from our conversations with both of our adoptive parents, they didn't even get to choose us.
Well, yeah.
So you're not even really chosen.
Not like you're in a...
You're just... Okay. I don't know how you're randomly picked, but...
picture this. We're now this age. You can fast forward. Maybe there's technology like this one day. You can fast forward, have an interview with your adult child and be like, oh, you'd fit in well. That'd be great. Mm-hmm. But you're a baby without speaking any language, let alone English, especially if you're an international adoptee. There's literally nothing to know that they fit into your life perfectly in the way that you would hope, or really in any way. So it's it's not like it's a pick and choose with so many different things. So,
and it's kind of like just having a baby. You don't know if what they're gonna, obviously they're gonna get some of your traits, things like that, but they're still their own person. Yeah. So it's not very different.
Yeah, it's kind of just a weird abstract thing to think about.
Yeah.
Let's see. I don't think either of us for a couple chapters. Yours, the next was the
Love is Dangerous.
Love is Dangerous element. I didn't note really much. I just starred the whole thing because I had nothing specific to say besides yes, it is dangerous.
Yeah, I think what really stuck out to me was on page 62, and it kind of jumps into the next section too, the relationship with the father, which I know we both have
talked about
and have underlined and things that we want to discuss. But mostly it was talking about how this girl cannot fully quite connect to her adoptive mother, and she doesn't know why. She sometimes just gets angry, and she has no reason for it, literally no reason for it. And she said, I just cannot discuss intimate feelings with her, which is really interesting because it takes me a while to do stuff like that. Growing up, I didn't want to ask her about certain things. And why is that? I don't know. So I thought that was very interesting and very accurate, but then it also a little bit you know, a little bit farther down, talking about those things or like difficult conversations, they always, or very deep conversations, they always end up in arguments. Or like I'd always end up mad, maybe because I'm just trying to shield myself, but I'd always get upset. And then it talked about how the distance, if you were talking on the phone, I love talking on the phone with my mom. That distance provided by the phone gave
like
her
safety?
security.
Interesting.
And I relate to that so much.
That's really interesting. And I guess, and I know we've kind of both experienced that where we're obviously very close with our parents now, you know, being in our late 20s, obviously that's very different. And I guess for me, I'm not sure if your brother had maybe did he have any closer relationship to your mom growing up as far as talking about stuff, or? I
would say no.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure, hard to say. I guess we never really, we're so different in age, and being a boy and being a girl, like different things, you know, you go to different, I feel like, genders for. Yeah. So it's hard to say.
You do have a different dynamic than I do. Personally, when it comes to that, it's like I knew my sister so much closer to my mom growing up. I knew that, like, 1,000%. And to this day, my sister tells my mom literally everything, and I don't, but it's also like I don't feel like I need to. And
it's not like you're not doing it on purpose. It's just...
No, but obviously, again, like being in my late 20s, like I see my parents all the time. They live very close. My sister doesn't live nearly as close. So it's like I've obviously grown into more of that. But it's still, when we were growing up, it was like, wow, this is like night and day. I just don't feel like I want to or can. I don't know.
Yeah, and I guess you might not even be able to answer this question, but do you think since she was so close to your mom, you just gravitated to your dad?
Not necessarily, because the stuff that I didn't talk to my mom about, I didn't just talk to my dad about. So...
Exactly.
It was just kind of like, okay, he just lets me be a goof and whatever.
Well, and that jumps literally right into the next thing.
Section,
where it says...
It's about the relationship with the father.
Yeah, and we've talked about this, I believe it was in episode 2 or 3, where we were really going to break it down. So this is on page 62 and 63.
Yeah.
One part that I underlined was, some adoptees find it easier to connect with their fathers than their mothers. Frequently, however, fathers are either absent or emotionally distant, placing most of the responsibility for the child's emotions and well-being on the mother, which makes sense. What you just said, being fun, free, you know, just...
it was,
Yeah.
Which is funny, because immediately after that, I underlined the next sentence. For those whose fathers are not distant, the relationship seems more straightforward and easier to define than with the mother. So it's kind of like less emotional, less like murky waters as far as what it is. It was just like lighthearted and fun, and
absolutely,
I can blame my dad for my Taco Bell addiction. So I think that's really beautiful.
It's just so interesting, and I guess I didn't have anything much more on that section.
I didn't either. It was more so just validating what you and I have talked about in the past, and I think something else another previous chapter had kind of talked about, but this is very much specific with the difference of, your parental relationships. Yeah. So I thought that was really interesting. Let's see. The next one was talking about like withdrawal and acting out. That was one that stuck out to me. Let me see. This section was just kind of talking about like anger, hostility, anxiety, outbursts, things like that, and how you don't feel yourself, or like people saying you acting out isn't being yourself, but it's in fact like really the true core of who you are, like when you're younger, if you're acting out, which didn't necessarily, I guess, really stick out, but it was saying you can't express those feelings for fear of rejection. And basically the false self, which we discussed in a way earlier episode, I think maybe episode or chapter 2, is that the false self may seem a matter of survival, which really stuck out to me. And same with a little excerpt they have about a specific adoptee that is talking about adoption in therapy. And
this made me so mad. I just put wow in an angry face.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Why? And
because he dismissed that it's...
Oh, because it was a good adoption. Or
good. And it's like unimportant. Like,
no, that one was interesting because I wrote down, I didn't talk about I didn't talk about my adoption really in depth in therapy until I was 27, which is like almost 2 years ago, but like.
And I never talked about it.
No, it was about a year ago.
Yeah, and I never talked about it until the moment I was going to go meet my birth mom.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of makes sense.
Because I'm like, well, got to get prepared for this.
Yeah,
this is going to screw me up.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's just sad how many people can't fully be themselves. More than I ever experienced it, so I can't really touch too deep on it. I think that's why I didn't have too much underlined, but...
The next section, it's funny, because you wrote down that this next section you had some things stick out, which I jotted down EP ? In this section, be like, Erica, is this you? So I'm curious to hear what you have to say about the section. The nurturing mother is the next section.
Yeah, and I think with this, pretty much the first sentence, it says, despite the limitations placed upon the adoptive mother, she can and does make a big difference in the life of her child. And then it goes on about all the things she does, skinnies, homework, feeds them, rocks them, kisses them. And pretty much, it was like, wow, yes, huge shout out to my mom, my adoptive mom, because she did hold it all together. Even though those emotional parts were a little bit harder, she was there every step of the way. So I think that was just like part of the triad that I had a hard time understanding when I was younger. Yeah, absolutely. And just so appreciative of her now. I think that's pretty much where I was going on with that. Not much otherwise birth mom, that connection.
Well, I guess I have a question then, because this second part of it is saying that after being reunited with birth mothers, that despite having that pain, they've felt like they've been given better opportunities than they would have had. And so now it's like that kind of...
I highlighted that.
Settles out a little bit with your adoptive mom a little bit? Do you
Absolutely.
Okay, that's interesting.
And it's hard to know if that was because I'm just coming out of my teen years.
I mean, yeah, it can be
or
so many...
because I met
my
birth mom.
That was a rough time for everybody,
but
yeah.
I do agree. I think just seeing, hearing both sides of the stories, understanding it all, understanding, all the opportunities and situations I could have been in and I am in now, it did open my eyes, absolutely. Yeah. So that's a very interesting point, but that was all I really had off that section.
Okay, so then, yeah, I mean, honestly, for me, that was pretty much, let's see, oh, the one extra thing that I mentioned here, let me see, 65, I guess I didn't add it here, but at the bottom of page 65, this was in the section, the right to selfhood, which again is kind of discussed a lot in the earlier chapters also, but it says, in my conversations with adoptees and their parents, it is clear that sometimes the adoptees' perceptions are correct, and sometimes they are more of a reflection of their own feelings of inadequacy, which they are projecting upon their parents. I'm sure that has a huge impact, and I'm sure that had an impact on me. I can almost guarantee that was part of it, was just the fact that I was like, well, I don't fit into this mold. I'm not X, Y, and Z. Sorry, not sorry, but also please don't hate me. It's like that's kind of how it feels reading it, and just being, that makes so much sense to me.
Absolutely, and I kind of just made it.
It would probably be really hard for people to identify, especially as maybe you being a teenager or either of us.
Yeah, well, I just wrote on here, because a lot of this was talking about just interests between the adoptive parents, and I was just like, thankfully my views and interests matched my family's. I've always thought it would just happen that way, but from reading this, it's not always the case, and it's just...
We lucked out.
I mean, honestly, and I just can't imagine, really not, if I love sports and they didn't, what would I do? You probably would hinder yourself. You wouldn't do that.
Which also kind of goes back to our continuing conversation about nature versus nurture, because you probably wouldn't have had the same opportunities to develop, your athleticism as a kid in Colombia, for instance. So you had that opportunity. That's part of it. But they helped you thrive with that. Absolutely.
Or what if they hated sports? Would I have ever been in sports? It's just interesting if that was truly who I was and had the athletic ability, it would have came out no matter what. Or is it because they're a huge sports family?
I think, and I can obviously go about that a different side, because my sister and I both did sports a little bit in high school. And I was a runner for a long time, but then I had that leg condition that really messed things up. But I was obviously musical from I don't know, when I was like 3, I was singing in the back seat of the car all the time.
And I think that's very different because that's
and I mean,
something
thank God my family was theater people. Because if my dad was like, you will be in sports, I'd be like, no, thank you. Like, I can't. Nope. We will not like waste this singing voice in a locker room. I refuse. So, but I think that's kind of just a really cool coincidence for both of us. And I think for me, it's like, all right, my parents love to come to my theater and choir stuff. Thank goodness they do. Because that's what I would be into regardless. Because I feel like that's just like a natural thing. Although it was nurtured by them, it was very much like, all right.
Very interesting.
It's here. So, yeah, I thought that was really interesting. It feels like the beginning of this second section, I feel a very different vibe.
Absolutely. Because
I'm like trying to understand something different. And it's just kind of also interesting going through it and seeing how fewer, I should say, notes compared to the last chapters. Because I was like, there was less like, oh my gosh, this is so validating. It was more like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And kind of trying to get into thinking about the other parts of the triad.
Yes, that's literally what I put part of the summary.
Oh my gosh, really?
The last paragraph, it just talks about how difficult it is for the adoptive mother of the newborn baby to take on this concept of the primal wound. And it's a big chapter, or excuse me, big paragraph. So all I put was a huge arrow that said, this last paragraph really hits deep with all 3 people in the triad.
Yeah.
And I just said, I'm so sorry, Mom, you did more for me than I ever could imagine. Like, that was just like a little note because I know I made it difficult, but it's difficult for her. Like, I just couldn't even imagine. It's already difficult to have a baby, but on top of the trauma, the things, those 4...
Oh, yeah, the 4 concepts
scenarios,
or whatever they called them at the beginning, that
you didn't know you were getting into or didn't know you were even processing yourself. It's just very interesting. So, again, I'd love, love, love to hear from more adoptive mothers, parents, fathers, your take on it, your views. That would be super interesting for me to just kind of understand your side of the story.
And just talking about those 4, what are we calling them? 4 areas of concern, if we want to call them that. Obviously, concern not having a negative connotation. But, and I'm kind of just doing this on the fly. But I would like to suggest that if there are adoptive parents listening to this, or especially hopeful adoptive parents, writing those 4 down, keeping those in a spot where you can go back and reflect on them just as those 4 points, rather than being like, I need to study this book cover to cover and figure everything out. It's like, what are your reflections of these 4 things as you're either going through this process or as you have an adoptive child growing up? It's like, I think that those 4 things,
they nail it on
the head.
And it's every aspect of it. It's perfect.
Yeah. I think those would be really beneficial just to not get overloaded. So, I mean, I think that can be something that we put out as a resource and publish as just specifically like, hey, what about these 4 things? What are we thinking about them? And just as you're progressing in, certain things, like just to give it a different perspective, when it comes to either your child as they're growing up or before you've even adopted your child, having that be a constant kind of train of thought.
Or it even talked about, you didn't even think about adoption. So what if you were never even thinking about adoption? How would you come around those scenarios?
Can you imagine that? If you adopted and it was kind of out of nowhere because you just assumed you would be able to,
like, people our age, some of our friends are starting to have children more in their 30s now, which is more
it's
common.
Very much assumed or hoped that you will be able to, and you don't really have to face that until you can't.
Absolutely.
Like, why? I mean, why would you? Yeah. You really don't have to. So,
and I guess these discussion questions are things you can comment on multiple times because the scenarios, the situations, they're ever changing.
Yeah.
And we've noticed that with some of these questions. Like, before I'd be like, I think I was this way, but now I'm this way, It
goes back to us reading it the first time and now.
Absolutely. Okay, so brief overview. How did this make you feel?
Let's see. Well, I took some notes. Let's see.
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, you go first. I'm like,
Okay, so for me, I think it really made me feel a little sad for the adoptive parents. And I know our podcast is mostly about adoptees and just getting our voices out there, especially adult adoptees who get just looked over. And and I know a lot of people will disagree or hate that I even say this, but I think my adoptive parents did and still does a lot for me. And it really made me realize the triad of adoption, meaning, you know, the birth mom, the adoptive parents, the adoptee, just that everyone has some type of pain. It's not all the same, and adoptees definitely feel it harder and more lifelong, I would say, because adoptive parents, you know, you don't have it. You have it with the infant, and I don't think once you're an adult adoptee, again, you're just overlooked.
Yeah,
and you're still
that's
going
a really
through
good
all
point.
of those things.
Yeah.
And so just, you know, granted, again, the adoptees have the hardest part, and I think a lot of other adoptees have a much harder situation than we have. And I can't speak on every situation, and I feel even worse for those people because I know, in a sense, we did get lucky. And I never want to downplay, you know, your feelings if you had awful birth parents or adoptive parents. I couldn't imagine having that burden on top of already all the different emotions and feelings that you've already had. So I guess I just want to praise my adoptive parents for doing the best they could, because it was difficult. And even if they didn't know the exact meaning behind it, and if they're learning it now, even though I'm an adult, they had some type of struggle. And, you know, that's kind of interesting. It just opened my eyes to the triad.
I do get what you mean by those feelings. Because for me, it was like when reading this, I would think about how I not even reacted, either like growing up or even still do now, that might be harming myself or my relationship with the loving family that I was provided with. And obviously this is in no way to harp on the past or like call anybody out, but I was just thinking about ways that things could have been gone about in a different or better way, just because it was laying out what people can do for a different or better kind of positive thing. But, and I don't know, it's like I also wouldn't necessarily change anything. It would have changed things now, but it's also I'm in a really good place right now with my family. So it's like, again, it's no element of being like, well, shame on you. You did this wrong. It's like, well, you know, social media or like production like this didn't exist back then. This wasn't as openly talked about. So it's kind of just neither here nor there. And obviously there's no element to the work in this podcast in talking through each chapter where I want to shame any adoptive parents or that are truly trying their best and loving their child that was adopted as they would a child that they had biologically. Yes. So for me, this was really just a chapter that validated my negative thoughts of being, you know, too inadequate to exist in this life that I was given, let alone the world at all, is what I wrote. And then I put in parentheses, big yikes, because that's just kind of like where it left me, because after I read your notes here, I was like, huh, like, it was really interesting. So different. Yeah, but it's like, because I get what you're saying, and I think that this was the first time the book was really like, hey, so let's zoom in on the adoptive parents. How are they dealing with all of this? And it was the first time I really had to think about it, and it was just like, I can connect with that. I can connect with that. It's less so just like validating as far as like putting a name to a feeling as it is just saying, yep, this happened. Yep, this makes sense. I guess I'm just glad where I'm at now.
Yeah.
That
is the perfect way to put it.
Yeah. I think that's kind of where this one left me. It was kind of more is what it is, but not in a negative way, like I said.
Wow.
Yes.
Big yikes.
Big yikes. That's what I always got going on there, is just when there's a big thought, I'm like, whoa. I guess as far as the questions here that we, want to discuss, we've obviously mentioned the 4 areas of concern. And I guess kind of just to put it blatantly, like, do adoptive parents agree with those 4 areas of concern as far as around not being aware? And I guess just to review those one more time, I suppose, just to name them again. The first one being, the mother has not had the benefit of the 40-week preparation period of gestation. Neither parent may have been alerted to the fact that their baby has suffered a trauma upon being separated from his biological mother. Most adoptive parents have not dealt with their feelings about their own losses, i.e. fertility. And those who already have biological children may not have adequately explored their reasons for wanting to adopt or the impact this will have on their family life.
And if there's more points that you have talked about, that would be very interesting too. Mm-hmm. Like, do you have other points where it's like, this is also my concern? Things like that would be another good thing to put into discussion. It's literally open for whatever and however you feel.
And then our second discussion question is, and I guess we'll start with asking you, how does the term real parents make you feel as an adoptee?
Oh, I hate it. I've always hated that question, and it's like, well, I don't know. They'll ask, are your adoptive parents your real parents? Well, yeah, they raised me. Well, is your birth mom your real mom? Well, yeah, she gave birth to me. You know, it's like...
See, I guess I don't get it ever that way. It's more like, have you met your real parents? I'm like...
I've gotten all ways. Literally, like, have you met your real birth mom? Are those your real parents over there? Or where's your real parents? Or, you know, all of those different areas of where it could happen, I've gotten them all. And it's not the correct way to ask.
Mm-hmm. And it's like, would you... I don't know if you had... I guess to just put it in a different perspective, if you are someone who has their biological parents nearby, and like I always try to think about it in the other perspective is like with Mother's Day coming up, for instance, it's like if your mother passed away a long time ago or even recently or something like that, like, ooh, what are you and your mom doing for Mother's Day? How does that make you feel?
Yeah.
Put it in that perspective. That is asking an adoptee that kind of question or that kind of vibe of things is so much like, I don't know, if you imagine that and don't have your mom around, it's like punch to the gut is just so intense as far as like, oh, she's not here. Like, that's what I immediately think of is like, oh. So if somebody says like, oh, have you met your real mom? It's like, we went to brunch the other day. It was pretty awesome. Like, I see my real mom all the time because she's my mom. Like, what's your question? You know, that's kind of how I put it or kind of feel about it. And I think more people are coming around to it, and I kind of now, especially when people are like, oh, well, have you met your real parents? I'm like, it's actually bio parents. It's biological because they're my biological parents. My real parents are who raised me and that I have a relationship with now. And I'm very stern about it and just kind of like, you're wrong. Yeah. Let me call you out real quick.
Yeah, I don't like it. And if you're unsure of what to say, either say adoptive parents, biological parents, those are the correct terms to use.
Yep. And
then you'll feel us out. We'll get more comfortable. Like, those are my parents. That's probably what you'll hear us say. Yeah. I mean, I never say, oh, those are my adoptive parents over there. Like, that seems odd.
No. Yeah, absolutely not.
So, well, thank you so much for joining us with the Chapter 5 Book Club series.
Yeah, it was a good discussion for this, and we're obviously getting into our second section of the Primal Wound, so if you haven't already, be sure to get this book and follow along with us. Check out our discussion questions if you have any that you want to add to see if others have any contribution to that conversation, or if you want to send us questions as far as how we felt about this or anything along those lines, you can find us on all social media, colombianinfluence.com, or just Facebook, Instagram, all those good things.
Where can they get the book?
We're going to get the book? Oh my gosh. They can go to our bookshop at bookshop.org and find... I know, isn't that crazy? However, what I recommend, go to colombianinfluence.com, COLOMBIAN, influence.com. Go to resources, go to our bookshop, and you can buy Primal Wound from our bookshop. Part of the proceeds will go to local bookshops exclusively, as well as a small stipend for us. So just to keep our production and everything going and bringing you guys good content. So be sure to purchase it that way if you can. But we will move on to the next chapter shortly. So until next time.
Later.
Bye.